Yes, well, my graduation project is focused on musculoskeletal reconstruction, and I wanted to look at the two different processes that you can follow to do that. And one is called the inside-out process, and the other is called the outside-in process. And for the inside-out process, I looked at the Cretian dwarf deer, which is an extinct species of dwarf deer that lived on the island of Crete during the Pleistocene. And essentially what I did was looked at its skeletal remains and built up an illustration solely based on the remains that were at the museum. And then for the outside-in process, I looked at the great bustard, which is a species of bird, the largest species, I think the heaviest flying species in Europe, I believe. And I started from the outside in with that, so I illustrated a live bustard and then fit the skeleton into that instead. Yeah. Well, I have a personal interest in animals, especially. I love to illustrate them, and I'm also very interested in natural history museums, and I wanted to sort of gain insights into the kind of research that they do there. So I intentionally reached out to supervisors who worked at natural history museums. So yeah. So I had two external advisors. Firstly, Dr. Joanne Cooper from the Natural History Museum at Tring, and she is the curator of the avian collection at the museum, and I produced the bustard illustrations for her, and then for the Cretian dwarf deer illustrations, my external advisor was Alexandra van der Geer, and she is a researcher at the Naturalis Museum in Leiden. For the researchers, their target audience is fellow colleagues who are not specialised in the species that I was illustrating. But personally, for my thesis project, the purpose of the illustrations is to help up-and-coming scientific illustrators, potentially students of the programme, to sort of see how one might approach a musculoskeletal reconstruction project. Yeah, so yeah, there's two assignments that we do. There's the lion assignment, the lion plaster cast assignment, and then the anatomical life drawing assignment that we also have. And you know, when we start doing them in the first years, you know, we're given advice from you guys, but then I thought it would be interesting for first years to see how you can approach them from different perspectives, again from the inside out or from the outside in perspective. So yeah. My main research question was how to depict illustrations in like a dynamic and engaging way, but making sure that the bones were proportionally correct as well. Because this was something that I found with a lot of previous illustrations, is that the bones themselves were, you know, they were proportionally correct, but they weren't articulated correctly as well, because artists would have the bones in front of them, but they wouldn't be able to figure out how they fit together. So I wanted to do that in an accurate way that was engaging for the target audience as well. So it was a little bit different for both projects. For the Candia service, I only had the Mount Naturalis as a form of reference. So I went to Naturalis on a sort of journey, which was really exciting. And I drew the skeleton firsthand and took first-hand observations and sketches of it, and took measurements and whatnot, but it was quite a decayed skeleton, and it had been a bit mishandled. So it was also then my job to look at online references of its closest living relative, which is the fallow deer, and then use that to sort of rectify the bones and make sure that they were in the correct position and the correct distance apart. And then for the great bustard, I got to go to the Cotswolds Wildlife Park, and I sketched individuals firsthand and tried to get them in different positions to sort of capture their movement and their flow. So that was really exciting to do, because I was just surrounded by live bustards, which was amazing. And then in terms of the skeleton, I had a reference material at the Natural History Museum at Tring, which I was able to access, and I did it in a sort of similar manner as I did with the Candia service deer. So I drew the bones and used like the barbed wire frame technique to sort of capture the volume and understand like their proportions and their overall shapes and everything. But then in terms of articulating it, then I had to use online references as well to make sure that I got it correctly. So with the Cretan dwarf deer, it's a lot down to interpretation. You know, you can use the fallow deer, its closest living relative, as a reference to build up the locomotor system from the bones. So yeah, it's very, very different in terms of, it's a lot more down to the interpretation of the individual artist. I need to decide like how thick the muscles will be and their density and whatnot. Whereas for the great bustard, because it's a live specimen, I have it directly in front of me, so it's a little bit less down to interpretation. It's more, the challenge there was more aligning the skeleton with the external features of the bird. And that was a bit of a difficulty because it's a living bustard. It has these big fluffy feathers that, you know, it's hard to see underneath them as well. So that was a challenge there. So yeah, there were definite differences between the two as well. And then with the dwarf deer, because it's no longer living, there's no fur, so you kind of have to imagine what the fur would have been like as well. So yeah. So I use a mixture of digital and traditional techniques. But I know Alexandra specified that she wanted her illustrations to be done in a traditional pencil technique, so that's what I did, and then I just tidied it up in Photoshop and then superimposed the pencil drawing of the skeleton onto the locomotor system, and yeah, made everything look clean and nicer. And then for the great bustard, Joanne sort of let me be free and play around with what I wanted to, and I tried lots of different mediums. I gave watercolour a bit of a try, and I really liked the effect of it, but it just would have taken a long time to prepare everything and to sort it out. So then I went back to my chosen medium, which is do graphite pencil and then colorise in Photoshop. But yeah. So I learned that there are definite differences between ungulate anatomy and avian anatomy, and it's really interesting to see what those differences are. So for example, in the great bustard, it has a modified sternum or a keel, which is really, really cool because it's so different from the sternum of the Cretan dwarf deer. And they also have these ulcinate processes along their ribs, which help them to fly. So it was really interesting to see how the anatomy feeds into the function of these two different species. What else did I learn? I was quite ambitious with the project, and I wanted to do a lot of different things at once. And I think in the future I would choose to do a smaller amount and put more depth and focus into that. So yeah, it was definitely a case of learning how to manage time and manage multiple projects at once, especially between two different advisors. So that was a really, really good learning process. So I loved getting the insights into the museums and going behind the scenes and seeing what Joanne and Alexandra did in terms of their research. But I think for me the personal favourite was going to the Cotswolds and being invited to the wildlife park to sit in the enclosure with the bustards, because it was truly a magical experience. I was surrounded by these 6 individuals, and they were so curious. I was sketching them, and they just wanted to see what I was doing, and it was really, really lovely to see that. So yeah, that was my favourite part, I think. But yeah.